I call the Planning Commission for March 17th, 2025 to order at 7:03 p.m. First item on the agenda will be roll call. I'm present, Chair Andre Tessman, Vice Chair Kilcup.
Present.
All right, thanks so much. Commissioner Lambert indicated via email ahead of time that he would be absent, so I'll come back and move that we excuse him. Commissioner Maruziak?
Present.
Commissioner Murphy?
Present.
And we have a new join, Commissioner Simon Hurley, but he also requested excusal from this first one, but he will be joining us at the next meeting. Okay, so with that being said, I move that we properly excuse Commissioners Lambert and Hurley. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. All right, the ayes have it. All right, we do have a quorum as we established, so that's great. I move that we approve the agenda as written. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. All right, the agenda is approved. All right, and actually, I don't see any public present for comments, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that as I already did. And let's go ahead and move on to council liaison report.
Greetings, Commission. We had a pretty short council meeting at our last one, at least before we went into some rather long extended executive sessions. So I don't really have much of an update for you tonight, but I'd be happy to take any questions that you folks have. See if I know any answers.
Yeah, I'll start in person and then come back to you, Vice Chair Kilcup. Commissioner Mruziak, any questions?
Yeah, actually, there's a public notice for a water retainment thing outside the golf course, like at the second green. Is that the one we talked about, or is that something totally different?
I'm not sure if it's the one next to the second green. If it's the one that I'm thinking of, then that is the one that was mandated by the state that we have to replace the water retention pond that we had been using for the reclaimed water, which is, I believe it's called Eagle Lake. Look at the map, but yeah, Eagle Lake, yeah. So if that's the same one, yes, it'd be a large
off a ridge.
reservoir.
Like it's up by Eagle Lake, but and that's the one that costs $10 million.
Something like that, yeah. I don't have the number offhand, but yeah.
Okay. And the funny to that is out of unbudgeted, out of general budget, or what?
Well, there is some good news. We did get some extra money from the state for a low interest loan. They were going to give us, I wish I had the numbers in front of me here. I think it was something like 6 million originally, and now it's closer to 8. I don't know if staff has better numbers than that, but I think it's something like that.
Sounds right.
Yeah, it's something in that ballpark. So we will have some extra that is going to have to come out of the, not the general fund, but out of the capital fund for enterprise funds. So that's, you know, our utilities and that sort of thing. So it's not the general fund, but yeah, it'll have to be paid for at least for the rest of it. Yeah.
Okay.
How long was the term for the loan? Do you know?
I believe there was 30 years.
30 years.
I think. Might have been 20.
At a low 22%?
Exactly. It might have been 20 years. It's somewhere in that range. Don't remember off the top of my head, though.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. That's all good.
Commissioner Murphy?
Nothing this week.
All right. Vice Chair Kilcup?
Nothing from me.
All right. And nothing for me either. Thank you so much, Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you.
All right. And we already completed, so forgive me. Excuse me. All right. So looking at the minutes dated March 3rd, 2025, I move that we approve those minutes as written. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Thank you. And new business, we have comprehensive plans, climate element, and Chris is with us, I believe.
Yes, yeah.
All right. All right, Chris, thanks for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I'm Chris Green with OTAC. We are consultants working with City of Snoqualmie. We did some work on the comprehensive plan periodic update, and then have been working on updating the climate element for Snoqualmie's comprehensive plan. So I believe October was the last time I talked to the Planning Commission about this project. So wanted to kind of get an update to the Planning Commission. And then also we have kind of a series of workshops. We're getting towards kind of the heart of the planning process. So we'll go over that a little bit. Let me share my screen here. Oops. All right, so yeah, we'll do a quick overview. There's one of the key groups that we've been working with is the Climate Planning Advisory Team, or CPAT. And so a few of you are probably familiar with that group or even serve on it. So some of that will be pretty familiar. We'll do a recap. We've done some community engagement on the project starting kind of early on, and then really in the last few weeks have really had an opportunity to visit the community in person and get some survey results, and wanted to kind of fill you in on that. And then the biggest part is there's two sub elements, and I'll actually go right into that. So the climate element is a comprehensive plan element, so a new chapter, and it requires two sub-elements. One is climate resilience, so adapting to changes, natural hazards, impacts to the community from climate change, and then greenhouse gas emissions reduction, so actually reducing emissions, not just from the city operations or things like that, but the community as a whole. So sort of looking at a similar scope as the rest of the comprehensive plan, but this really focuses on climate resilience. So community planning advisory team, just some updates on what they've been up to. So providing some technical guidance and then community input. So there's representatives from different organizations and fields, and also community, different members of the community and points of view. So we have kind of a variety of perspectives there, and it's a little bit of a deeper dive into the content, especially in the onset, kind of looking at what they've worked on, looking at some of the climate hazards, community assets. So a big part of the process is pairing community assets to potential impacts and making sure that assets are protected, but also mobilized by the community to help with that mitigation process. Reviewing some of the hazards in terms of different sectors. And then we'll talk a little bit about this. There's some preliminary results from the greenhouse gas inventory. Also in progress, looking at existing plans and policies and where there's gaps that this climate element could help fill. And then prioritizing impacts was one that the CPAT actually met on Friday morning. So that was their most recent meeting and focused a lot on prioritizing impacts. What this group has coming up is looking at the full results of the greenhouse gas inventory, and I'll explain that and kind of why that's an in progress one in just a moment. And then developing policies and action items and the draft element itself. So it's at the planning process at a stage right now where kind of the next big lift after this assessment in terms of climate resilience is starting to develop some goals and policies. So it's been, that group has met 4 times, and it's been, there's definitely been a lot of forward progress there. So actually the first one is no longer an upcoming meeting because it was on Friday. But that focused on assessing vulnerability and risk from the impacts. If we have a full greenhouse gas emissions inventory, that's going to be a focus in April, along with looking at emissions reduction targets, and then starting to develop policies and action items. There'll be planning commission workshops as well, kind of interspersed within this. And so planning commission will be seeing these things as well during this time, and then reviewing the draft element itself in May. So quick recap of some of the public engagement, especially the recent events. As I mentioned, there's the climate planning advisory team. We've had stakeholder interviews that with city staff, and we had a kind of, some of them have been more one-on-one interviews, and some of them closer to focus groups. So we had a youth focus group at Mount Si High School with high school students. We've talked to public works, fire, and insurance and floodplain experts in the community. So having some of those stakeholder interviews, online and in-person engagement. So we had an in-person workshop in addition to those interviews and focus groups. I mentioned we had an in-person workshop on February 27th. Yes, so pretty recently, in that very room, we had a in-person workshop and then an online workshop that followed up last week on Thursday, March 6th. And then talking to planning commission and committees as a part of it as well. You guys are part of that right now. So yeah, kind of again recapping, we were able to talk to some folks through community workshop and open house, and then these focus groups. Got to talk a little bit about what some of the priority climate impacts, what people anticipated seeing, and what some of the, starting to begin to talk about what strategies may hold some of the most promise for the plan itself. There was a online survey. We have a project website, and that survey talked a lot about, we tried to kind of keep it fairly parallel with what we talked about in the workshops, but especially asking about different hazards and especially priorities for what the city should address, both for resilience and then different greenhouse gas emissions sources. And then the planning commission. So this is kind of envisioned as the first of a series of 3 workshops that we will go through as the element is being developed. Tonight we will talk a little bit about the emissions inventory and some preliminary findings from that. And then in April, draft goals, policies, and then measures for resilience and emissions reduction. So really starting to get closer to actual action items that would be adopted in the plan, and then the climate element itself in May, or a draft version of it. So looking in more detail at the 2 sub-elements that make up the climate element. The resilience sub-element had quite a bit more work that's gone into this initially, and this is kind of by design. This involves quite a bit of community assistance in identifying hazards and understanding how they impact Snoqualmie. So we've looked at those hazards, looked at existing plans and policies, and there's a pretty good track record, both in the most recent periodic update, the previous comprehensive plan, and even all the way back to 2009 with the City of Snoqualmie sustainability strategy. A lot of existing policies that we can really highlight in this climate element and show what the city's working on. But we are currently in that mode of looking at these hazards that have been identified, looking at them in terms of different risks to the community, what the highest priorities are, and beginning to work towards implementation. As I mentioned, draft goals and policies are next. So we're pretty far along in the process for the resilience sub-element. And one of the key pieces of this is looking at different categories of hazards that are expected to affect City of Snoqualmie in the next 20 years, which is the planning horizon for the plan, and beginning to prioritize some of those. And we did have some pretty significant feedback from the CPAT on this as well. So some of these may change a little bit, but in short, the three kind of highest priority items that have come out of some of those discussions are drought, and actually drought and reduced snowpack sort of have a connection as well. Extreme heat, so especially those prolonged days where there are prolonged stretches where there's really high temperatures, and then extreme precipitation events. That does kind of tie to flooding, and given the impact of flooding historically on the community and kind of that being central, it probably is surprising to see flooding here on this second level. The rationale behind that is that there is quite a bit that the community's had to do to, and continues to do, to try to be more resilient in terms of flooding. That, you know, has always been something, regardless of climate change. It's kind of been a constant issue for the community to work through, and so there is already a lot going on. And so looking at comprehensive plan gaps and kind of gaps in city programs, there's not as much of a gap on flooding because it's been something that's always sort of been out there as a point of focus. Reduced snowpack does tie pretty close to drought and water sources, but it's sort of an indirect thing in terms of what the city may be dealing with directly. Sea level rise kind of goes without saying. It's pretty far from the ocean. And then wildfires, one that we did get a lot of feedback from the CPAT on smoke, especially, and focusing more on smoke impacts being tied to wildfire, and that there is things that can be done to mitigate for that and make the community more resilient. In terms of wildfire itself, it's sort of a you know, what we've gathered in early analysis and talking to people in the community and specialists in fire is that there's not as much of a issue of wildfire potentially being something in Snoqualmie where there's frequent fires, where there's more being done to manage them, like you might see in Eastern Washington, Central Washington, or more arid parts of the state. But it's more of like a high volume fire type that's a little more rare, but potentially a lot more severe when it does occur. So more into the kind of rare but potentially really catastrophic natural disaster level, but perhaps less that can go on to, manage that risk within the city. But we did get some feedback on potentially elevating wildfire back up in the rankings there. And I wanted to pause for a moment, just to kind of hear from the Planning Commission a little bit. That was an initial bit of information about the process, and then a little bit about where we're at in terms of resiliency. See if there was any comments at this point or questions about the process.
Commissioner Marizia?
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify the last thing you were talking about. It seems like the last 5 years, there's a week in September where you can't go outside or you can't work out outside because it's smoke and inhalation is considered, bad for particulates and stuff. So I see why that would get raised up above flooding, where I think we have a thing, or sea level rise. I think it's definitely higher, and it's the smoke. And it didn't used to be that way. I mean, the last 5 years, again, it seems like there's a week in September every year where it's just nasty. So yeah, I think anything we could do for resiliency on that would be nice, other than just stay indoors.
Yeah, Mr. Green, can I add color to that?
Yeah, please.
So I'd raise three points that came up in the last CPAP meeting. One tied directly to the smoke, and kind of put a seed in the commission's mind for this. But when we talked about the smoke, one thing we talked about in particular was the fact that COVID highlighted the importance of proper ventilation within public buildings, schools, coming first and foremost, libraries. But as we are potentially in a position to build or modify, a total of 3 schools here in the next couple of years, something that this commission should think of when it comes to our review is what the ventilation plans are, what the ventilation investment is, because the reality is the smoke's not going away. It's probably just going to get worse, right? So
Well, I hope our forest management, the statewide is better, but yeah.
yeah. So that was one thing that came up. Two, concerning the extreme heat and wildfire risk. What Mr. Green was describing, I think, was I think you said that the fire department highlighted this, but in our conversation this came up, which is Snoqualmie itself, obviously, doesn't have necessarily a high natural fire risk per se, but we've seen now, 2 years ago, a fire on the west side of the Cascades, not too far from Snoqualmie. And really our challenge that came out is the fact that we get the winds that we do through the gap, right, through the valley. And that's essentially what the Palisades fire was, right? It was just those Santa Ana winds coming from east to west and then just acting like a hairdryer, right? So we kind of do face that risk. And so, while the odds are potentially lower in terms of there being a wildfire or an ignition source at the same time that those wind conditions occur, that is something that CPAT and the Planning Commission will have to plan to mitigate, because that's, the winds are just a reality. You can't keep a fence in this town.
Yeah.
And then there was a third one. Oh, and then the third thing that stood out to me from the last meeting was the investments the city of Snoqualmie has made and continue to make in our urban forestry program are paying dividends and will pay even, are scientifically likely to pay even more dividends in the future, even with a changing climate, because we'll be able to reduce the urban heat island effect and just have a more tolerable environment. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight those 3 discussion points from the meeting. But I don't know if you had any more questions.
Just wanted to kind of highlight your urban forestry. I mean, one thing that is really neat when you live anywhere around here is the wildlife that's everywhere. I mean, you start with the birds, and then you got the deer and, the ducks and everything else.
Bears.
So I don't know if that'd be included in there, but it'd certainly be something that you'd want to have protection as well as human health, the wildlife.
Councilmember Johnson?
Yeah, question. I'm curious if this came up at all in the discussions around wildfires, is how the ridge is, well, it's a ridge, it's elevated compared to the surrounding lowlands, and that fires can sometimes have a tendency to move more quickly uphill. And if there's any discussion of kinds of natural buffers that may exist around the ridge, like the golf course, and if those are either have been placed there intentionally or could be used as kind of a staging area, and again a buffer if there were fires at the bottom of the hill, but the winds, as you mentioned, that could whip things up the hill.
Mr. Green, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think that particularly came up as we were focused on hazard identification more than mitigation in the last conversation. But do you have anything there, Mr. Green?
Yeah, that in particular didn't come up. I know there is quite a bit of, wildland urban interface at the edges of the ridge, so that's been discussed a little bit. It does, it's a lot harder to have like a fire break or things like that on a kind of the scale of fire that would potentially be coming in if there was something larger. And so there's a little bit less opportunity to just kind of mitigate something and sort of have it be something that the city adapts to, as much as kind of being prepared more in like an emergency response kind of way. And so that's kind of part of that.
One other quick thought was with regard to the smoke. It was 2 or 3 years ago that things were just so bad with the smoke coming from the other side of the Cascades, and we went and got an air filter in the house. So there's some public education about other things that people can do as well. So that's one of the things I wanted to bring up.
Thank you. Commissioner Murphy?
Yeah, I wonder, one of the things that occurred to me was in this process, and you mentioned that the fire department was a stakeholder in this, and wanting to understand like when the last time our like fire evacuation protocols have been updated. I know a lot of people have moved into the ridge and into just Snoqualmie, and the Snoqualmie Valley over the last 10, 15 years. Are those plans that are perhaps obsolete? I don't know the answer to those questions, but something to kind of look into in terms of like, if God forbid some worst case scenario takes place, do we have the right plan in place to get people out of here? I think is important. And this is to me like something really worth, like, I know, we're talking about unforeseen, right? But I think as we're seeing down in California and other places, those, the scenario you described in terms of the wind, the dry, all it takes is a really dry, hot October and winds coming through the gap early for those conditions to take place. That's not like a stretch of the imagination from my perspective. So I think, I don't know, this is a place that if we wanted to like double down more in terms of just like getting more consultation from the fire department on emergency management, response, and looking at maybe consulting experts within DNS at the state level might be something to think about as well. So this will be an area of interest of mine as well, just because I think, we just saw the devastation in California, and it's not a great leap of imagination to have those like, worst case scenarios line up here.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go. I was just gonna say, and we have unique geography here, and so we have very limited, ingress and egress routes.
Right.
So that's gonna, even under the best of circumstances. So, sorry, Mr. Green, go.
I was just gonna say, in the context of like a comprehensive plan as well, there's things like there's infrastructure components even to that emergency response and evacuation. So, I think those are things that definitely need to be considered, even if it's, not something that's directly emergency response. It's like helps facilitate that response to make sure that there's those, programs in place, but also just physically the infrastructure and routes and things like that.
So, Dina Dean, City Clerk here. I was just going to let you know that council adopted the fire department's comprehensive emergency management plan on February 24th of this year.
Okay.
So it is
Oh, wow. Okay.
attached to resolution 1708, and I can send out that link if you would like.
Thank you.
I think
Yes.
it's awesome.
Commissioner Rizzo?
Well, no, I mean, so it sure sounds like not just the commission, but also the council would look at this slide and say the wildfire is too low. I mean, we didn't zoom in on drought, we didn't zoom in on extreme participation, but there's just, from where we're sitting in the comments, I don't think there's any way wildfire should be as low as sea level rise. So I think before we show this slide again, we should correct that.
Pretty consistent with what we heard from CPAT as well. So, yes, thank you.
Commissioner?
Yeah, question, and this is just my own kind of personal interest in transportation, and I know VMT reduction is a pretty significant part of any sort of GHG reduction plan. So, and I don't see a ton of like airtime here in the deck related to like, reduction in vehicles miles traveled, but wanted to get any thoughts or any like insight into what the committee had discussed as it relates to that component, or if that maybe wasn't an area of focus.
That's coming up.
Coming up. Okay. Great.
Vice Chair Kokup, do you have anything?
No, but I did appreciate the conversation around the wildfires. The only question I had, just because I do not know, is the temperature of the air for wildfires like a consideration in our area compared to California for the spread, or would that be a factor?
I don't know kind of on a technical level. I know that it's potentially, like a major wildfire is anticipated to go, and probably air temperature being a part of that, as well as, wind and some of the other things mentioned, would increase that risk. It goes from, depending on the modeling used, like a 0.2%, so like a, quote unquote 500-year event, to closer to like a 100 or 200-year event with climate change. So I would say it's one of those, in a lot of these, we look at like the likelihood versus the overall severity, and it's one that's really low likelihood and just like the highest severity possible if it does happen.
Sure. On that note, we recently had some family visiting from Sweden, and they were commenting on how gorgeous it is here, and also asking who takes care of our forests. And we said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Who clears out the underbrush and makes the plan for forest fires, essentially." And so, yeah, we went back and I believe for us it's the forestry. You could tell me which department it is, but then essentially what we heard was that they put plans in place for clearing out the underbrush and also doing like strategic clear cutting that would create gaps for the spread of wildfire. And they are almost immediately blocked by the Sierra Club. and put into a holding pattern for 8 to 10 years. And so I didn't know that. But what I was wondering is there something that we could be doing that is preventative that would not be blocked by, or to be in collaboration or something to put those preventative measures in place?
I think that's one of the kind of things, and I'm not, you know, a specifically like fire expert, but what we've kind of read and been told is that the fire ecology of places like Western Washington is a little bit different in terms of management versus some place, you know, on the east side, for instance, where doing things like clearing out the brush is, you know, it's a lot drier and it's just more feasible to be doing those kinds of things. Where in a place like Snoqualmie, even with climate changes, it's a very humid environment, very high level of biomass in the forest. And so, you know, like the urban forestry department manages the forests, then there's 1,200 acres within the city itself. But it's just a different technique, is my understanding, than one would use in Sierra Nevada or the east side of the Cascades.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it is I do agree with the other commissioners that there's, even though it's a lower likelihood, it almost doesn't matter if there's any likelihood given what we've witnessed taking place. And the fact that we've been impacted by smoke so heavily and knowing kind of how near to us it has become, that we should make clear our plans.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is all. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's it.
All right. I'll move forward then. Just kind of wrapping up that resilience sub-element, but these are kind of things to think about for both of the sub-elements. Is there's these different sectors that the Department of Commerce kind of has encouraged communities to look at, and I think they're pretty useful as like a way to make sure that you're thinking of all the different potential aspects where these impacts could be happening within the community. We've tried to also think about a little bit outside of these boxes as well when we think about impacts, but kind of a good sort of baseline of where those impacts could take place. And as we look at resilience measures in the future, that's one kind of way we can sort of categorize them to say, like, which sector is this helping, or probably multiple sectors for some of the policies or goals that would be helped. So I mentioned some of those planning documents that feed into the resilience sub-element. So the sustainability strategy, comprehensive plan itself. So some policies may move into the climate element, that and some of them probably, even though they affect some of the same things and might relate pretty directly to the climate element, they may just stay where they are. So that'll be part of that process, is looking at that. And then the 2020 King County Hazard Mitigation Plan, which has the Snoqualmie, they call it an annex in it. That's also in the process of being updated, so that will help inform the resilience piece as well. Looking at gaps and opportunities, and these are pretty high level, but just kind of getting a sense of what we're seeing as we go through that process. Some of the things are just kind of updating based on current data or or, newer data. And that's just pretty standard with any kind of comprehensive planning effort, but, especially a new element like this. Specificity and measurable standards is a big one. There is some policies that say, things like that are more aspirational or try to do this. And looking at things where in the 5-year review, for instance, that the city will do down the road, looking at the comprehensive plan and how things are going, being specific enough that the future planning commission or near future planning commission will be able to say yes or no, or have some kind of better way of assessing whether things are working or not. Residential and commercial displacement. So looking at, if there are events and people have to relocate, especially flooding is one that, as I mentioned, that's pretty well covered, but that aspect of it, just kind of being ready for that. Co-benefits of publicly owned property and facilities. So this is looking at if there are a lot of communities are looking at either standalone projects or a lot of the time incorporating into existing city facilities, facilities where there's an emergency event or something that's maybe not quite an emergency, but is something like the smoke event, that the city's been experiencing every year. Things that could be activated for those kind of events or kind of in place already. And then considering the cost and making sure as you're prioritizing things that there are funds available to implement those changes, so that that's kind of comes back to the implementability, I guess. So the other sub element is greenhouse gas emissions reduction. This one is not quite as far along. So the city was able to, there's a kind of a countywide greenhouse gas emissions inventory that was just conducted, and it's being broken into results for individual cities. And so that's pretty helpful because for one thing, there's a good economy of scale in kind of doing that type of inventory, regionally, and then looking at it within specific cities rather than having like 30 separate inventories going on at once. And then it makes it a lot more comparable across cities. That data is still pending, so that's something that we're working on, and Mona and I and the city's commerce representative kind of figuring out how that's going to happen in terms of timing. But the next steps on that are emissions reductions targets. So there's different sectors that are, and you'll see this in a moment, that contribute to emissions within the city or originating there. And that those targets sort of feed into, and the types of targets being set, what types of goals and policies may be considered. And so in this case, the inventory is kind of a big piece of it, and there's a lot more of a role both in terms of community and the CPAT and then the Planning Commission in interpreting that inventory and helping to set that direction. So again, the available data. So there's the last full version used 2019 data. 2022 is the baseline that's required for this round of climate elements. So it seemed, it takes a while for the data to be finalized. So it's, always kind of a few years back, but that we have the 2019 data and we have 2022 data that's for all of King County. We don't have 2022 data yet for Snoqualmie specifically.
Guys, question about that?
Yeah.
Is most of the building due to heating and cooking?
Yeah. It's electricity use basically is the main, and heating, or gas, electricity.
If you see this.
And then, and we'll actually on the next slide, and this is pretty small. I don't expect everybody to be pouring over this, but to just kind of give you a sense of the type of information that is out there. It looks at things like electricity, natural gas, and then it looks at like residential, commercial, and industrial. So it's tries to break those down a little bit. Passenger vehicles versus freight. And then aviation, this is one that actually makes up a pretty big piece of the puzzle, and it's that's looking at aviation based on travel by members of the community, just sort of on an average or projected basis, freight needs, things like that related to aviation. So when I first saw that one, I was a little bit confused because I know there's no airport.
So quick question. Are those 21 and 22 numbers correct?
So that was what was being projected at that time.
We projected a dramatic decrease in electricity usage, 21, 22?
Yeah, so and actually I just maybe just switch my headset just a second. Well, maybe it'll be fine. I just got a little thing saying my headset's low on batteries. So actually then a couple slides ahead here. So these are from something they call the wedge tool, where it's looking at different scenarios. And so each one of those stripes on the wedge is like a source of emissions, and the black line is like if no action was taken, and then the red line looks at different policies and different actions that the state and city would be taking. And so it's sort of looking at like what gets you to that difference. And so with something like electricity use going down, I think that anticipated quite a decrease due to more green energy being part of the grid, especially. And then
you've shown a 40% decrease from 2019 to 22. I don't think that makes sense. It's just too big a decrease. You're going from 55,000 to 32,000? 33,000?
Depending on the source. It's not a 40% decrease in consumption. It's just a 40% decrease in emissions.
Well,
and I know that's aggressive.
Even there you go.
Yeah.
At the top level, you got 81 to 59. Anyway, I just make sure those, because if we did that, I'd like to know how we did that, because it's pretty amazing.
And this is again based on 2019, so it's probably pretty optimistic at that time. I think so you can see like here was the projected decrease of kind of all the measures were taken essentially, and then those big reductions would have been in on-road vehicles and electricity. And then the actuals are not that much lower. So I can tell you from like looking at the King County 2022, it obviously did not decrease that dramatically. It did, but not like that.
But do we really expect that significant a decline, over the next 10 years? Do we really expect that?
That's part of the mandated reduction goals that the state has, and so part of this planning is that cities then need to be making a similar reduction.
So, so let me understand, the mandated goes from 140,000 down to 20,000 in 25 years?
Yeah, it's a very aggressive policy,
Wow.
and that is it's basically to target 2050 as sort of the target year at the state level. This plan only goes to 2045 because it's a 20-year horizon, but
We see 2050 there, but yeah. The far right, the last dot is 2050.
yeah, this projection that was made was looking at up to 2050.
Councilmember Johnson?
Yeah, I was wondering if, so in the past, our local energy producers and those who would deliver it to us would have to purchase energy from out of state that would come from fossil fuel power plants. And I don't know to what degree that still happens, but I'm curious if that is included here, or if this would just be locally generated or generated in Washington State, et cetera.
Hydro, yeah.
Like, yeah, if this includes that or not.
Yeah, I mean, the big picture, and again, this is kind of looking at like older data, is that the idea is that a lot of that would come from the grid, and that energy being produced either locally or through hydro or solar or wind or lower carbon sources than today, or 2019 in this case, in this set of data.
Yeah. It used to be, and we can check it out, either 80 or 90%, a very high percentage of Washington's electricity was done from the Grand Coulee all the way down due to hydro, which was
Yeah,
in the nation by far. So if they just shut down a little bit of that purchases from, that would do it. Yeah, that would do it.
yeah, it'd be a big change.
I have one other question. It's kind of tangentially related, but I'm curious how well or if it's even a problem, PSC is keeping up with the increased demand for AC units. When a lot of the Ridge was built, a lot of units didn't have AC, but a lot of people have been installing them. And I wonder how the local infrastructure has been keeping up with that demand.
That's a good question, and
Just there's a question.
yeah, and not just, I mean, I think what you mentioned of like even between the construction of the Ridge and now is big, but then also looking 20 years into the future, thinking about like are more AC units going to be installed even beyond today, and then are they going to be used more? So yeah, that is the kind of thing that we need to look at when we're looking at this.
I have one more question if I could.
Yeah.
And that was about cooling centers. So for a lot of folks, when it gets too hot out, they might drive down to like a Walmart or something like that. We don't have too many big box stores here in the city. So I'm wondering, how if there is a plan for how we would communicate cooling centers that could house a lot of people, or not house, but that could fit a lot of people. If the expectation would be that those folks would just drive into Issaquah and hang out at one of their larger stores. It's just something that I was thinking about when we were looking at the extreme heat.
Can I add on here, Ms. Green?
Yeah.
So CPAT did discuss that, one of the first things we looked at during our first workshop was, community assets, right? That would enable resilience. And so, we talked about the hospital, we talked about the forthcoming splash pad, Also the forthcoming eventually expansion on to the YMCA. You know, those will all be likely very key assets for doing that, for responding to heat. Obviously the library, but it's fairly small, but we did talk about that.
Thanks.
Yeah, and kind of, I think looking at what those demands will be in the future, that's, you know, that's important, and seeing kind of what's out there.
So is this focus or contribution to the county or statewide effort? Or is it just what we're doing in Snoqualmie?
This is what's happening in Snoqualmie. So it's, you know, through Growth Management Act. So it's like a state level requirement, as a lot of the things in the comprehensive plan are. And so that's why it's tied to, you know, like the emissions reduction goal that the state has, because it is required to be consistent with that. And then similarly, you know, the county plays sort of a coordinating role, or in this case, data gathering is just a big piece of it, because,
Well,
you know,
two things
that-
on that. One, it'd be nice to understand from PSC, it's a shame Daryl's not here, you could help us out maybe. What their plans are, since they provide us, right? We don't generate, other than some solar installations, we don't really generate power here. And I'm not sure how the hydro at the falls makes sense there, but it'd be interesting to understand current power status just from electricity, because that's such a big section of it. Second thing, I watch This Week in Tech. It's a big podcast, Leo Laporte. You ever see him?
From the
I watched this guy
Atlantic,
decades. But anyway, he had an interesting thing that showed that a lot of big appliances were going down because of harmonics, because of AI, because people would basically put these servers in just under the threshold where they had to make a big permit, and they'd cluster them all around to support AI, and then you would get harmonics. So rather than be at 60 hertz, you drop down to 57 and come back up, and then your major appliances would go down. And he showed a nationwide map. Well, guess what? Seattle was one of those nasty areas for harmonics because of all the AI stuff. So I don't know. It'd also be interesting to hear from PSC if there's a way to prevent, you know, something outside force like AI, which is a real energy intensive thing, from impacting things outside our control. So
yeah,
anyway.
yeah, there's a lot of pieces of this that,
yeah, it was the data centers predominantly.
Well, yeah,
and their concern.
And they said things
Yeah.
like refrigerators and stuff going out, that they don't like that 60 hertz to 57 for a while and coming back up. They really
Yeah.
don't like that. And I don't know if you replace refrigerator and all, but beginning to wonder, yeah.
Need a mortgage.
Yeah. Anyway, it'd be nice to hear from PSC a little bit about
yeah,
their status.
and they are part of the CPAT. They do have a representative on CPAT, but we'll definitely be engaged with them more, as well as we get into the emissions piece of this, especially.
And to more directly answer Commissioner Marizziak's question, correct me if I'm wrong. So that updated data will come through, and we should avoid the deep dive in this session, because we'll look at the updated 22 data here at the next session.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I should have given a better caveat on that, of like, and I know this is like pretty small and hard to read, and in some ways, I'll admit that's on purpose, because it's not for the deep dive. It's sort of to say, like, here's what it'll look like when we actually get the real data.
Gotcha. Vice Chair Kilcup, did you have anything? I want to make sure we didn't.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
So, yeah,
And,
Councilmember Johnson.
just one quick thing on that then. I might understand this is the 2019 data that was used for 22,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
And then 22 would be used to 25. Yeah. Okay. So it'd just be interesting to compare the predicted versus actuals, and maybe make some judgments around how closely the predicted might be based on that trend. I don't know.
thank you for setting up my next slide. Because it is about looking at actually, and we've kind of talked about some of these things, so we think 2019 data is going to be somewhat consistent with 2022. We'll want to understand the data assumptions that were made. And we had a lot of good questions tonight about those, so kind of getting more in detail on those. But especially COVID, when looking between 2019 and 2022, potentially with remote work being such a big factor, different transportation patterns, potentially less commuting transportation, maybe more transportation in the local area. Residential electricity may be getting used more and maybe less in offices. But then it's also a pretty big trend in the last year or two, especially to return to office. And so, yeah, how much is permanent? How much is temporary? It's, years that had to kind of be mapped out ahead of time in terms of, they had to land on years to kind of set a standard, a benchmark for this. But it does feel like we're in time that's really hard to predict. And so I agree. It'll be interesting to see between 2019 and 2022 what actually did change. And that is things to think about too, is like even from 2022, that's our baseline year. We got to use, what comes out of that. But understanding trends after 2022 and trying to do our best to understand those will be really important. And then just legislative changes. So things like changes to natural gas usage or energy code was, I think, a big one in 2019 that they were really, looking at being, probably not as immediate, but for new construction over time, that could potentially have an impact. So legislative changes that have taken place in the last couple of years will also impact that. And then just kind of those policies will probably be based on those major emission sources. So commercial electricity and residential electricity you mentioned. Aviation, they did not anticipate in the 2019 wedge tool that would decrease much. It's hard to know externally if there would be major progress made, for instance, in greening of aviation or something like that. Yeah, a little harder to anticipate. And then, potentially changes to, this is where like actually in terms of planning at the local level, the transportation and passenger vehicles is one that, could potentially, even though it doesn't have as much impact as electricity, it's influenced, by comprehensive planning. So that concludes my presentation, but if there's more questions or further discussion.
Commissioner Murphy?
Yeah, on the slide before, I think, looking at it, less impact versus high impact. And I think that what you actually described in the voiceover is probably is a better way to look at it in terms of how can the city impact these things, like aviation, emissions and trying to get folks to fly less doesn't seem like something that the city is able to, is something the city can do. I think looking at how we can provide better transportation, make folks aware of the different alternatives to natural gas for their homes. And I know there's all sorts of incentive programs at the state and other levels of government there. But I think like as the group's looking at like things to consider, I think there's a whole lot of things to do on passenger vehicles and transportation and, looking at is our bus route optimized the right way for our community? are there other forms of like transportation and microtransit that can be deployed during special events or other types of, other times of year to get folks out of the cars, to get congestion reduced? I think like, obviously we're not a city, but like looking at some of these solutions is probably worth doing in the purview of this.
Mhm.
And yeah, because I think it's something that we have maybe the impact and the numbers are a little bit less, but certainly we have the ability to do something about them. So.
Yeah, yeah.
Where is it?
Yeah, just to kind of add to that thought on the residential area, it'd be nice to have like a case study of a best known method, right? So if you took a regular residential area, regular house, and you say, turn all the lights into LEDs that work out, and then convert everything you can reasonably convert. What is the delta there? How much savings do you get from the carbon emission? Because if it's significant for just a change of lights, I think we get a lot of action very quickly. But if we're relying on, very big entities like you were talking about, then I think it gets harder for the city and the residents to get behind it and figure out how to do it themselves.
Yeah,
So case study is the request. I mean, if there'd be a way to do a case study of this is a house on the ridge that is, unimproved, and here's the output, and here's the amount of output if you make improvements A, B, C, and D, right? And A would be the easy low hanging fruits, like replace light bulbs. B would be maybe a little bit harder, and then D would be, electric versus natural gas heating, something like that. Then I think we could really get our teeth into what can we
Mhm.
really do.
yeah, definitely.
Vice Chair Kokup, did you have any questions or comments?
No, I look forward to seeing the 2022 numbers.
Same.
Me too.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you. It's yeah, great to be. These are really helpful. This will help us kind of focus things up, and we'll yeah, it'll be a very very busy couple of months here, kind of refining this and bringing this back to the CPAD and to this group, and looking forward to.
Ms. Davis?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Chris, I just wanted to mention that the upcoming Planning Commission workshops that you've got April 14th down, and that's not a Planning Commission. It would be the 7th or the 21st.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Catch. All right. Well, anything else, Mr. Green?
That's all I have.
Okay, we appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate all the great comments and questions.
So,
And I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.
all right, have a good night.
You too.
All right, looking at the agenda, no issues for permit review, design review board. And then under legislative policy items, regulations, we are down to items of planning commissioner interest in the growth and economic development video. So let's go ahead and put a pin in items of planning commissioner interest, watch the video, and then we'll come back to that if that works for everyone. Okay.
Hi, I'm Mayor Matt Larson, and this is the second of a two-part series on growth and economic development in the city of Snoqualmie. This second part focuses primarily on economic development. Economic development is something that's not altogether understood by many folks. Some confuse it with shop local type programs. The difference with the shop local programs is it's a wonderful thing to do, but all we're doing is recirculating the same money in our community. Economic development is about trying to find purposes and uses that will bring additional monies or import money from outside the community into the community to make us a stronger and more thriving community. One of the challenges that Snoqualmie Ridge had that happened 15 years or so ago under a prior administration is that they succumbed to the pressure to size down the amount of retail. And the original mixed-use final plan for Snoqualmie Ridge, the retail area, was originally zoned to be about twice the size that we currently see. And to put that in perspective, the current area that you do see, if you added up all the buildings there, would add up to about 120,000 square feet, and that's equal to one Target store in Issaquah, which on a square foot basis, it makes about half the revenue that a Target store does. So we were essentially crippled in terms of our capacity to provide a more diverse revenue stream for the city of Snoqualmie. And to put that in perspective, one of the problems it created is we have a huge leakage, what's known as a leakage problem. One study we did several years ago showed that annually our residents spend about $82 million on retail expenditures, and of that, $60 million goes out of the city of Snoqualmie. Basically what that means is for every dollar that our resident spends, 73 cents of that goes out of the city of Snoqualmie to North Bend and primarily Issaquah. And to put that in perspective, for a typical Issaquah resident, for every dollar that they spend, not only do they capture the full dollar in Issaquah, but another $1.40 comes in from outside of their city. So for a $2.40 capture rate versus our leakage rate. So it affords an opportunity for a city like Issaquah to provide a lot of services without more pressure on property taxes and so forth. And the result for us, of course, is a tremendous pressure. You can see from this pie chart that we have the gray area on the pie chart is right now a little over 47%, and at full build-out, we'll be over 50% of our revenue stream will be dependent on property taxes, and another 17% from utility taxes on your cell phone bill, on your cable bill, on your water and sewer utilities, that all that helps support the general fund. So it's close to 67% of our revenue stream comes out of your pocket, and our goal over the last decade has been to try to diversify that to take that pressure off. One of the other challenges we've had is for the past decade, we've been working as we come to the full build out of Snoqualmie Ridge to make sure that we achieve what we call fiscal sustainability. In other words, that there's a lot of one-time revenues from growth, all the growth and development, and when the growth and development, all that one-time revenue goes away. And we have to make sure that the operations of the city can be dependent on the reoccurring ongoing revenues to make sure that we're fiscally sustainable at that time, so we don't have to keep chasing additional growth. And we did an exercise recently that said, let's take the last bit of one-time revenues out of our budget to see where we are as we approach the full build out of Snoqualmie Ridge over the next year and a half. And we see that we still have about $1 million gap, which is a long way, a better achievement from where we were 12 years ago when over half the budget was dependent on property taxes. Half the budget was dependent on one-time revenues. And so out of a $14 million budget, at least it's closed down to about $1 million. And I want to speak to some of the projects that we specifically are pursuing that we feel are consistent with our community values in order to achieve closing that gap. And by the way, this gap doesn't assume any staffing increases as our city's grown, as there's an increased demand on services. And that's why we're very thankful the voters supported a levy lid lift in November that helped us hire 2 more police officers and another firefighter. So one of the huge advantages for Snoqualmie, or one of the disadvantages geographically, is that North Bend grabs all of the retail to the market to the east outside of their city limits, and of course everything to the west goes to Issaquah. So we're really limited to a local market and can't tap into much of a regional market. So there simply isn't a big demand for retail or demand that can support retail, such as big box retail, nor would we frankly want that in Snoqualmie. We wouldn't want Walmarts and Home Depots. It's not consistent with our values of the spectacular, unique place we live in. And so the strategy that we've focused on is the fact that we have this incredible Snoqualmie Falls with 2 million visitors a year to the falls. We have the Northwest Railway Museum that we've done a great deal of work over the past 10 years to partner with the museum to do improvements there to make that a world-class museum. Their visitorship has gone from in the range of 40,000 a year to well over 100,000 visitors a year to the museum. We have national exposure for a small town of us on TV with things like the Boeing Classic. That's broadcast nationally, the Treehouse Masters program on Animal Planet, the Twin Peaks show that's just come out again, and also the Global Rallycross that's broadcast once a year on NBC, both nationally and globally. But the problem with a lot of this tourist activity that we have is we don't do an effective job of capturing those tourist dollars. And part of the strategy of capturing those dollars is to focus on more destination things like the Railway Museum or the mill site development. The type of activity you want to see around there is something like what you see in Woodinville, a type of tourist industry that's all built around wineries and wine tasting and wine processing, and that's our goal for there. So we're actually grabbing some of those visitors from the falls and bringing them over so they leave more dollars in town. And another key or critical strategy for tourism is overnight or lodging, a full spectrum and menu of lodging and hotels. Because with an overnight guest, we get 4 to 5 times more revenue that's left in our city than we do with a drive-through visitor. And the powerful thing about tourist dollars is they're the best kind of money to get because they leave money behind and they don't demand more schools or more parks or more police and fire services. And so it's the best kind of money to have. One of the ways that we rectify this to find land for that available, or to rectify what happened years ago when the retail area was shrunk down in size on Snoqualmie Ridge, was the council a few years back went across the parkway and we added additional zoning in what you see as these now red boxes here on just those lots on the Snoqualmie edge of the Snoqualmie Parkway, and we allowed for a retail zoning on those lots. Unfortunately, the developer would not take away the warehouse and commercial uses from those lots, so we said, fine, we're going to leave the 50-foot buffer there to assure those uses don't get built. However, if you bring a retail use like the grocery store, the Bartels, the New Mod Pizza, or a hotel, then we will allow you to use that buffer to encroach in the 50-foot buffer. So it was a huge incentive to get the retail that we felt we needed, and the lodging. And for those that might think, hey, we get that a hotel was needed, but it should have been somewhere else. As we've come to the full build out of Snoqualmie Ridge, we have less and less flexibility to have choices on where some of these uses go, and we can't dictate when the market will bring something like that forward. And so this was literally the last lot available on the entire Snoqualmie Ridge phases 1 and 2 where we could build that use. But it's a significant benefit for the city because it services the business park, anchor for that. It's an anchor for the retail center, services residents, and also provides that way to capture the tourists and visitors that come through Snoqualmie. So for other development projects that I'll do separate videos on each one, but I just wanted to give you the context with part 1 and part 2 on this, is the Hilton Hotel. I spoke a little bit about that and the efficacy of that. The Safeway that's coming in, expect to open in August 1st of this year, the Bartels drugstore, of course. The Salish expansion, which was actually given entitlements on over 15 years ago, or some 13, 14 years ago. And then which has been delayed due to recession and other issues in the market. And then lastly, the mill site, which I spoke about briefly. And again, I'll do another video that will go into more detail. But all told, the importance of these projects is the 2 that are in the works, the hotel and the Safeway, are going to garner upwards of about $750,000 of revenue for the city. And when you add the other 2 projects eventually to that, there would be another $750,000 to $1 million. Basically, all told, these 4 projects would bring about $1.5 million to $2 billion to the city of Snoqualmie, and it would more than close that gap and give us a buffer to address staffing increases, diversify our revenue portfolio. So the huge advantages is 1, keeps down significant pressures on property taxes and utility taxes. It gives us full control of our destiny. It means that we can pick and choose what sort of development comes in the future. We don't have to keep chasing more growth and development in Snoqualmie in order to keep the lights on and sustain city services or a high level of services. Again, it provides more services, as I stated, for the business park, the retail, and others where these projects do. And lastly, it really helps establish Snoqualmie as a premier destination, which we already are, but we just want to make sure we're capturing dollars and benefiting you by doing that. So thank you for taking the time, and if you have the time, please go look at some of the other videos.
How many videos in total are there?
You know, I was having that same thought when I was watching it. I'll check into that. I'm not sure.
Just curious, yeah.
Oh, there you go. You got a
Fiscal
bunch of them.
sustainability, Snoqualmie Ridge. Oh, but those are chapters in that video.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, just curious. Awesome. Okay. Well, I will open it up to items of planning commissioner interest. Let's start with Vice Chair Kilcup.
Nothing for me this evening.
All right. Commissioner Mrziak?
Yeah, I wanted to throw something out. We talked a little bit about drought in the previous discussion. I wonder if we could get a water status. I think a few years ago, we talked about just how we stand for fresh water in terms of, is there a situation where we've got to be decreasing per capita and just how that stands? And is there other things we can do about? And I just mentioned that because it sure seems like we've got a lot of gray water that we just run off. And I'd be very curious to know about what our freshwater status is. I lived in California for 22 years, and it's really no fun when that declines dramatically, over a 5-year period and you've got nothing to do. So probably be good just take a look at that.
I could certainly have Public Works
Yeah,
maybe come
yeah.
and address that.
They were here in a previous commission meeting, maybe it was a year ago or so, and I guess we were doing a pilot on recharging the aquifer.
Yeah, yeah. I
so
thought, yeah, that was a
be
couple
good
years
to
ago.
hear
Yeah,
about that, yeah.
So I'd like to see, how we doing? Because it sounded like we were heading for restrictions. And I'm just curious, is that still the case or what?
And in Seattle Metro, last year, the year before, there were water restrictions put in place because we're seeing reduced snowpack over the years. So we're already heading
Heading
in
down
that
that path.
direction, yeah.
Mhm.
Anything else, Commissioner Musil?
No,
All
good,
right,
thanks.
Commissioner Murphy?
Nothing this week.
Okay, nothing for me either. So that is short and sweet. All right. All right, that is everything on the agenda. I move that we conclude tonight's planning commission meeting. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor? All right. All right, have a good night, everyone.